Hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. This is the second video in the Myers-Briggs Types Analysis series, and in this video we're going to be talking about the SPs, the sensory perceivers. Now, if you don't know what these letters mean or what these cognitive functions that we're going to be talking about are, I've made a few videos in the past covering more basic MBTI concepts. In the last video, the SJ video, I kind of tied in a bit more of the complex explanation into the video itself. So if you're curious or new to the concept, definitely check those videos out, but for now, the SPs. The SP category, of course, consists of the ISTP, the ESTP, the ISFP, and the ESFP. Now, looking at the difference between SJs and SPs, you notice, of course, the only difference is the difference between the P and the J. So you may think that these are just more laid-back versions of the SJs. Now, on the surface, that may indeed appear true, but you'll find that in these Myers-Briggs letters, only really describe what's seen on the surface, and the cognitive functions describe more of how people prefer to make decisions. And you will see, for example, an ISFJ and an ISFP have an entirely different set of functions which describe their preferences and perspectives. They're considerably different despite having only one letter difference. We will, of course, get into the cognitive functions later, but for now, it will be sufficient to say that, like all S's, sensors, SPs tend to view things pragmatically. They're more down-to-earth, they're more focused on the immediate world around them. They may see abstract concepts as not only boring, but kind of a waste of time. They prefer their own database of experience to their own intuition, and they tend to form big pictures from facts as opposed to Ns, who start with a big picture and then work out the facts from there. And like all Ps, perceivers, they tend to be more flexible, laid back, and really a little bit more independent. They tend to take on large projects in bursts of energy or enthusiasm as opposed to a J who would prefer a system or a plan, and likewise they prefer to adapt to situations rather than stick to a preconceived plan, and they prefer to have their calendars open so that they can have a wider ability to adapt to new circumstances. SPs are bold, active, fairly individualistic, and exciting people. The whole concept of living in the moment comes naturally to them, as much of their mental focus is on experiencing the present world in its full. Though it may of course still be important to them, SPs have less of a focus on traditional value systems and common morals, and more of a focus on conclusions about the world which they've made independently. In fact, they may not be very hesitant to openly resist external structures placed on them that they have a problem with, especially authority, somewhat taking pleasure in being out of line. They will often be critical of anyone, especially authority, if it operates in contradiction in what they believe to be morally or logically consistent. Because much of their focus is geared toward, in some way or another, experiencing the outer world, they will likely have more active and physically engaging interests and hobbies such as sports, dancing, nature, cars, art, etc. They will also generally pick up on new trends, and even though their sense of fashion and style may not be conventional, whatever niche of fashion they fit into, they generally work it well. The quote from Voltaire, "In matters of fashion, swim with the currents, and in matters of principle, stand like a rock," is very likely applicable to these types of people. However, on the other side, SP's boldness and desire for external stimulation and individual identity can wind them up into trouble. While their rejection of authority and societal pressures may at times be beneficial, they may overdo it at times, and in combining this with their preference for external stimulation, may engage in risky behavior such as drug use, sex, or criminal activity. This is only exacerbated by the fact that, unlike their NP counterparts who may think too long on something and fail to act, SPs may impulsively act before thinking and end up in dangerous or harmful situations. At times, they may intentionally create negative situations for the stimulation of the event, such as a physical fight or dramatic emotional conflict. Furthermore, having a weaker intuition sense, they may be very abrasive to new ideas, especially those which threaten the conclusions which they have made about the world themselves, and especially those which are based off abstract concepts which they tend to find dull. To more structured types, such as the SJs, they may seem lazier and unorganized. As was mentioned, they prefer to adapt to situations in their own way, and this is a notable surface distinction between SJs and SPs, and this is very commonly a reason why an SP and an SJ might come into conflict. However, these negative aspects which SPs have a higher tendency for are definitely not commonly exhibited in the extreme, nor do most SPs have a desire for that to be the case. Their preference for the external world and ability to cope well with it, and preference for independent decision-making often make jobs such as various types of artists, engineers, scientists, architects, fashion designers, actors, coaches, economists, emergency room workers, etc. with, of course, a considerable difference between STPs and SFPs, very attracting to them. So having made a brief description here, let's get into the cognitive functions that are the basis for what we see on the surface of these SP types. Here are the four types again: the ISTP, the ESTP, the ISFP, and the ESFP. and here are their cognitive functions. Now before we begin, I want to make a distinction here between an SJ and an SP who otherwise shares the same letters. Taking the ISTJ and ISTP here, for example, the ISTP has TI, SE, NI, and FE, whereas the ISTJ has SI, TE, FI, and NE. No shared cognitive functions, as you can see. So, as I said, on the surface we may only see the J and P difference, what's described in the Myers-Briggs descriptions that they give of these letters, but when you go deeper into cognitive functions and see how two people of these types prefer to live, how they make decisions, how they view things, etc., it's obvious that the preferred behavior can be described as a very different function stack. The PJ difference is perhaps the second most important difference between two people after, I would say, the NS difference. But we will see in the next two videos that despite the difference, NFJs and NFPs are grouped in the same NF category, and the NTs are like this too, unlike the S's, despite opposite function stacks, which is interesting, but we'll get to that later. Back to the SP functions. So as we can see here, SPs are defined by their preference for the behaviors described by the function SE, extroverted sensing. This, you will note, is the opposite focus of SI, which we discussed in the last video regarding the SJ types. Because SPs make up 1/4 of the population, it's important to ask, what is SE? SE is a function involved in taking in the world around you as it is in the present moment. It's focusing on what you see, feel, hear, taste, smell, etc., and combining it all together to form the picture of the present moment. Now again, like with all the functions, all humans do this to varying degrees, but SEs really prefer to focus on these sensations and connect with them, and to simplify, it's all about external stimulation. Now again, I by no means mean to suggest that SPs are all like adrenaline junkies or something, but they enjoy external stimulation and those activities, and accordingly, they enjoy building friendships with people who share these hobbies, and they enjoy just centering a lot of what they do, such as their work or other interests, around these sorts of things. And also, it should be noted as well that this does not necessarily mean that they all enjoy straining or physically demanding activities like sports. Either music or video games are definitely something that are up their alleys as well. So to compare the SI of the SJs here for clarification, SJs tend to notice associations and pattern and sensory data a bit better, but SEs tend to view the world and remember it in very vivid detail. Furthermore, it should be clear by now, SPs don't just want to observe their external environment, they're very drawn to interacting with the moment. And this is why a lot of famous athletes, musicians, artists, etc. are SPs. They're very good at getting into the moment and making the most of it. However, strong SE leaves a weak NI. NI is the intuition function devoted to the connection of concepts, especially abstract concepts. Last video we mentioned that SJs had NE, extroverted intuition, which was involved in sort of an explosion of new ideas, brainstorming, but NI is more of a system building function wherein new ideas are organized to fit a central point. It's kind of just connecting points together until finally you say, aha, you have a moment where you understand something. A bunch of interconnections have been made to form a larger picture and draw things together. It's this function which describes why SPs might sometimes have these abstract interests, why SPs may at times just intuitively know something is going to happen, but the use of intuition, NI specifically, is a lot more common in an NI lead, like an INFJ or an INTJ, who they just have a feeling when something's going to happen. They're good at putting two and two together, and often they may be right. But in SPs, this function is weaker, and it only comes out when encouraged or necessary, or when supporting the two main functions. They will often prefer to make decisions based off what they've perceived with SE than what they come to believe through NI. Now let's get to the difference between the STPs and the SFPs. Starting with the SFPs. SFPs lead with FI, introverted feeling. Well, what is introverted feeling? Well, it's essentially a function which judges the world according to a system of values and ethics which the person believes are ideal, in which the FI lead will often spend their lives trying to connect to and exhibit in themselves throughout their lives. SFPs are often on a quest to find themselves, in a sense, and discover ideal principles which they should commit themselves to, and combined with SE, they often believe that this database of morals and values can be improved upon and tested by experiences in the external world. They want to interact with the world and gain sort of life experience. This by no means indicates that SFPs are rigid people who adhere themselves to strict moral code. The majority of them are actually fairly easygoing and flexible and only become combative when certain lines are crossed, And keep in mind as well, this set of values is not necessarily going to be in accordance with what society expects of people, like an SJ would have a tendency to focus on. Not only do ISFPs and ESFPs prefer to make their own judgments about the world, but many of them will often come to the conclusion that society is corrupt, that other people's opinions about them don't really matter that much, and that the evil of society is kind of a threat to ideal behavior and individuality that they tend to strive for. So in other words, the man is trying to bring them down, and they're very aware of that. This is why many SFPs are attracted to music, particularly a rebellious kind of music, looking at Jimi Hendrix, Eminem, David Bowie, Prince, Trent Reznor, Billy Joe Armstrong, Bob Dylan. Music is not only an SE activity, but it's an opportunity to connect with FI, and even in some cases challenge the evil of society in favor of a more moral lifestyle or more moral actions, endearing individuality and sense of self, and often they may act starkly in contradiction to what society deems moral. They may be very rebellious in their own quest to connect with their own established moral ideal, as we could call it. And in many of these artists' lyrics, you can see that being of significant importance and get a little bit of a more extreme perspective of an SFP, but it still is revealing into how FI works and what they're really all about. Strong FI, though, leaves tertiary or inferior TE extroverted thinking. I'm sure you're getting the point by now that these tertiary or inferior functions, the weaker functions, only really become very dominant in the decision-making process when encouraged or necessary, but they do of course play a supportive role in general behavior and decision-making. TE is of course focused on obtaining the most efficient organization of the external environment. It may display itself when SFPs are explaining something or organizing things. Some people claim that extroverted thinkers tend to talk more fluidly and rapidly when explaining things. What I personally have noticed and take what I have noticed with a grain of salt because it's not really documented research, but I've seen SFPs and NFPs, TE inferiors, preferring to kind of organize things into piles and sort them that way, which is interesting because this is not how TE leads like STJs would prefer to organize things. Again, though, this is just personal observation. I'm not sure how cemented that is in actual study. ISTPs and ESTPs' lead judging function, however, is TI, introverted thinking. What is TI? Well, TI is a function focused on organizing things into a logical and consistent framework. Where you might see a TE lead be very concerned with organizing the environment in an efficient, rational basis, TIs are going to be concerned with doing this with the mental picture they have in their head. So they're going to be attracted to logic, problem solving, and they're going to be very focused on the truth. Now, while STPs can be a bit insensitive and really can be very critical towards people who they feel aren't using logic or are excessively emotional, some would say even more insensitive really than their NTP counterparts because of the impulsivity of SE. But usually if you can practically and explain a flaw in their thinking, they won't take it personally or be combative. Usually introverted thinkers are concerned with expressing things very precisely. They don't like to be very vague or leave room for confusion. Now, in INTPs and ENTPs, they'll have a tendency to achieve this by using more precise vocabulary and what might be seen as fluff or big words, but the ISTP and the ESTP are going to be a bit more laconic. They're going to simply state what they feel needs to be stated in simple and clear terms. TI's love of system attracts STPs towards science, math, and engineering, some very stereotypical STP interests. Again, are cars or nature or some sort of practical activity where they can employ problem solving in a system. And like all SPs, STPs usually handle very stimulating or somewhat chaotic situations very well. As I hinted towards, SFPs usually go through pressuring situations with SE with a very good sense of self and understanding of their own emotions and how they're feeling, and STPs can usually go through pressuring situations with a good grasp on practical logic and a healthy amount of skepticism, and in particularly stressful situations, more matured STPs with this skepticism, logical and independent thought, boldness, etc., can become sort of leader-like, and STPs like Theodore Roosevelt, General Patton, Winston Churchill, etc. were all very much this type of leader. Donald Trump, the recently elected American president, is a good example of this, and I by no means mean to take a side either way here or encourage the comment section to become a political battleground. But for people who do support Donald Trump, a fairly stereotypical ESTP, they definitely see him as this type of leader, and that is exactly the type of leader that he portrayed himself as throughout his campaign and into now his presidency. And furthermore, from the opposite point of view, it can be stated that critics of Donald Trump often cite behavior which are some of the more negative aspects of an ESTP, the brash, impulsive, insensitive comments and such, which have sparked plenty of debates, is very stereotypical of an SE and TI lead. But again, I don't mean to go into politics too much. A strong TI naturally leaves a weak FE, the function dedicated towards a focus on the feeling and welfare of others and making decisions according to how they will influence group feeling and in accordance with ethics. While STPs may be seen as insensitive and may definitely at times be insensitive, deep down they do want other people to feel happy. They will want there to be harmony between a group of people and for there to be good relations on a person-to-person level, and will often be critical of people who unnecessarily disrupt the group harmony, especially if it's over what they perceive to be emotion. But they will often lack the know-how to really make others feel comfortable or happy, or, on a broader scale, it's more difficult for them to pick up on people's emotions or intentions and help them reach their ideals in the ways that an FE lead like an ENFJ or an ISFJ would. FE will accordingly express itself somewhat awkwardly in STPs, and combined with SE, they may, for example, go all out and buy the romantic partner very expensive gifts or something similar and extravagant, just as an example. So, in conclusion, SPs are individualistic, bold, practical, and exciting people. They have a preference for experiencing the world in very detailed beauty and are absolutely the type who lives in the moment. They may at times be impulsive or anti-establishment, and while this can lead them into trouble, this can also be the grounds for new insight and new ways of doing things. They may often have a tendency to think abstractly and take interest in abstract concepts, but often they will prefer to see the world as it is and look at the bottom line of how things are and build their picture of what the world is like from the facts they establish throughout their lives. And even though this may make them seem abrasive to abstract ideas and may lead them to have trouble questioning their own judgments, the unique benefits of this type of thinking are of considerable value to the world. Now, to finish off, here are some SP statistics. SPs constitute 27% of the US population. The ISFP is 8.8%, the ESFP is 8.5%, the ISTP is 5.4%, and the ESTP is 4.3%. So from this, by the way, we can note, SEs constitute 75%, 3/4 of the general Western population. SPs are about 1/4, and remember, SJs are about 1/2. Famous ESFPs include Ronald Reagan, Peter the Great, Will Smith, Ringo Starr, and Katy Perry. Famous ISFPs include Ulysses S. Grant, Michael Jackson, Brad Pitt, Jacqueline Kennedy, and Princess Diana. Famous ISTPs include Steve Jobs, Ron Paul, Clint Eastwood, Bruce Lee, and Kristen Stewart. Famous ESTPs include Malcolm X, George W. Bush, Thomas Edison, Winston Churchill, and Andrew Jackson. So that is the SP category in a nutshell. In the next two videos, we'll be discussing the remaining quarter of the population, the intuitive types, starting with the NFs, the intuitive feelers. And you'll see that even though the judging functions remain the same, the lead intuitors can be very different from their sensory counterparts. So stay tuned for those videos, and for more videos on subjects like these and a wide variety of other interesting subjects, be sure to check out Fiverr Learning and subscribe. Thank you for watching.